look at the text at the end of Being in Time. Without going through the whole Hegelian thing, I think I touched on it last time, would be on a particular passage I wanted to focus in on page 396 of Being in Time, just in the middle of the page. Whether Hegel's interpretation of time and spirit and their connection is correct and has an ontologically primordial basis at all cannot be discussed now. However, that the formal and dialectical construction of the connection of spirit and time can be ventured at all reveals the primordial kinship of both. Hegel's construction was prompted by his arduous struggle to conceive the concretion of the spirit. So, as I think I indicated before and earlier in the pages leading up to this, he points out that for Hegel, spirit falls into time. All right, and so the falling of spirit in Hegel into time is Hegel's way of, in Heidegger's terms, conceiving the concretion of spirit. So time and space, or time here taken as the truth of space, is the, as it were, the means by which spirit concretizes itself in the form of, but of course recoups itself from that moment of concretization by recognizing that concretization, which otherwise involves in Hegel a certain alienation of spirit, is nevertheless a self-alienation. So in that recognition that time and space are the moment in which spirit itself alienates itself from itself in becoming temporally concrete, it recoups, it realizes, it comes to know itself as absolute spirit, we might say. The following statement, says Heidegger, from the concluding chapter of his Phenomenology of Spirit, makes that known, quoting Hegel. Thus time appears as the very fate...
Second full paragraph, going into the quote from the Phenomenology.
Hi, sorry. Well, you make a trinity today, so that's good, And I will be the quaternal element. Okay, we just taking a very brief look at the end of Being in Time on page 396 in the bottom half of the page, second paragraph up. So he says, Heidegger says, the following statement from the concluding chapter of his Phenomenology of Spirit makes that known. Thus time, then quote Hegel, thus time appears as the very fate and necessity of spirit when it is not in itself complete. Okay, so that's a way of putting what I was trying to say a moment ago, right? In other words, the spirit has to fall into time in Hegel because it is, before it does that, it's not concrete, right? But the concretion, the falling into time, is not the last word in Hegel. So thus time appears as the very fate and necessity of spirit when it is not in itself complete. The necessity of its giving self-consciousness a richer share in consciousness, of setting in motion the immediacy of the in itself, the form in which substance is in consciousness, or conversely, of its realizing and revealing the in itself taken as what is inward. And this is what is first inward, that is, vindicating it for the certainty of itself. In the falling into time in Hegel, the immediacy of the in itself is, you could say, is vindicated that is, its, I want to say its legitimacy consists in its being, in effect, a necessary moment of spirit's coming to an absolute knowledge of itself as that outside of which there is nothing, including time and space. All right, so then Heidegger says, which is the important point, I guess, in the context of Being in Time, in the bottom paragraph on 396, our existential analytic of Dasein, on the other hand, begins with the concretion of factically thrown existence and reveals temporality as what makes such existence primordially possible. Spirit does not first... if spirit falls into time in Hegel for the reasons that have been indicated, that doesn't happen for Heidegger. Spirit does not first fall into time, but exists as the primordial temporalizing of temporality. Temporality temporalizes world-time, in whose horizon history can appear as an occurrence within time. Spirit does not fall into time, but factical existence falls in falling prey out of primordial authentic temporality, which primordial authentic temporality would be Heidegger's understanding of what he elsewhere has alluded to once earlier in the text, which we noted last time, would be for Heidegger, you might say, authentic or true spirituality, right? The true spirituality of Dasein consists in its primordial temporality, which temporalizes. So spirit itself, in other words, does not fall into time, but it is the primordial constitution of Dasein, in terms of which the falling prey, the falling of Dasein into the lostness of the day, comes about. Okay.
So for the Hegel, the fall into time, where was spirit before that? Is that a question that can be asked?
Well, carefully it can be asked. In other words, it's not like there's anywhere else where to be. But in the dynamic, spirit is, as it were, where would it be? It would be apart by itself. In other words, it would be, if you do it in terms of the dialectic, spirit, time and space, and then the moment of individualizing in which that fall, right, the limit, see, the fall would be a limitation. Spirit would be effectively infinite, unlimited, but as such, it would remain, remain in need of a concretization.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Does that help? So
it's not. That makes sense. There's a necessity of the falling in order for it to know its concretion, so that it then can understand that it actually isn't.
Well, to understand that what truth its concretion has is its own doing.
Is its own doing.
Is spirit's own doing.
Okay.
But
in this, I guess I hear in the background the realization of the finitization of the spirit as being nothing.
You have to be careful.
Yeah. Okay.
In and of itself, it's qua finite. It's nothing.
Right.
But the infinity of the spirit is proven, as it were, if I can put it that way. Just precisely because Heidegger doesn't like proofs, right? Hegel is into proofs, and what he's saying in effect is that the non-being, in fact, he says this, and I quote it often enough, both in person and in text here and there. The summary statement of Hegel's position is that the nothingness of the finite is the being of the infinite. Okay? So if the infinite spirit, if I just run those two together for the sake of clarity, some kind of clarity, if the infinite spirit could not fall into time, then it would not be truly infinite. It would be limited by the fact that it could only be infinite as long as it avoided manifesting itself in the form of time and space. All right? So it truly undergoes a moment of finitude. It really does. And this is where the incarnation becomes central to Hegel's. This is why for Hegel, the Christian religion, is what he calls the absolute, or sometimes translated the consummate religion. He means the absolute religion. And I think that's what he says in the German. The absolute religion. And the reason for that is that in Christianity, one understands in Hegelian terms that God really becomes a human being. And becomes so really a human being that there's no repetition of that. Just as there's only one you, whether you like it or not. Okay, but the Dalai Lama is one of a series of incarnations of the divine. So Hegel is saying in Christianity, the incarnation of the divine is perfectly, to emphasize here, perfectly unique And that means that the Spirit, God, as Hegel reads the Christian theology, the Spirit or God is, as it were, proves its, I want to say, real infinity, right? By not finding real finitude to be an obstacle to it, something that it cannot actually be. You say, well, once having done that, right? Then for Hegel, the third moment is Pentecost. The third moment is the fact that the incarnate Word, in theological terms, the Jesus who was God incarnate, that individual, to come back to where we were at a moment ago, intellectually, has no truth of its own. The truth of it is its place in this absolute self-manifestation of the divine Spirit. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
Yeah.
All right. And that's very Protestant of Hegel, right? So generally speaking, right, the fact that the Protestant cross does not have the body on it, you see, would be a kind of everyday way of articulating what Catholicism doesn't articulate, right? And in fact, articulates the difference that the moment of incarnation has a truth of its own. Mm-hmm. And that's so profound, because if the moment of incarnation has a truth of its own, then what we're into is the transformation of the world. Then the incarnation makes a difference, a real difference in time and space, right? That's why that gives you a clue as to what history means in the thinking now occurring, that it does not mean in Hegel and does not mean in Heidegger, right? Or if it does, it very tangentially and unclearly, it might have something of that, but I think ultimately no, because he is, I think, deeply committed to the modern understanding. Does that in any way answer your question?
Thank you.
Okay, now, so we're going to shift to the contributions, and so in doing that, since I didn't already do it, I'll start by asking, are there questions on the assignment, observations, objections?
No, the only thing I would say is that I wish I had been reading it in German, because I think this translation is worse than
well, it takes liberties, right?
Yeah, and it's an
It's
awkward,
worse than that.
Yeah, this is readable. It's quite readable.
Yeah.
This is not readable. In some aspects, it's not readable because they try to be too faithful to the original, and it leads to very strange creation of meaning. And so I have been, and sometimes I can't even find the equivalent in German. Meaning I cannot find the equivalent in German actually of what they're trying to translate, like Lesung.
Yeah,
It's
right.
It's not a German word really.
No, but it's a Heideggerian word.
Yeah.
So you can't blame it all on the translation, right? In other words,
That is true. That is true. Yeah.
Right.
But we are reading it in the translation, so I'm stumbling over things that
No, I understand.
normally I wouldn't. So that's my preliminary
Okay.
reaction.
Okay, all right. Okay, any other?
I'd like to borrow mine,
You have
the
German?
original, the 1926 translation
You mean it's better?
does it?
Is it better?
In the Mac.
I thought it, well,
Of which? Or what are we talking? Of this?
No,
No, I don't mean this. No, of the,
but I meant this. This is fine actually. This is quite readable.
Right.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Okay. I thought you were objecting to
No,
this
I
as
was
well.
no. This is
Okay.
fine. I was
Okay.
making.
I have the German edition of this, but I'm not going to give it to you because I need it myself,
Right.
because I don't have the advantage of speaking German, so I have to go back. But you're right. In other words, I don't know whether you had a chance to read the translator's
Yes,
introduction.
I did.
So that maybe give you some clue as to what they're doing and why they're doing it and so forth. But I think it seems, in fairness to them, it's partly Heidegger's fault. Right?
I would see that.
Yeah. Okay. You have anything or no?
But let's just get into the text. I think
Okay.
there's some things.
All right, so if we start off what is actually page 3, I guess, the beginning of the text. Beginning in the third paragraph. The public title does correspond to the matter insofar as in the age of crossing from metaphysics into being historical thinking, one can venture only an attempt to think according to a more originary, basic stance within the question of the truth of being. So first of all, which I kind of anticipated whenever I've spoken thus far, alluded to this text, that in this text the fundamental structure of what's going on is this thing that he calls the crossing. And the crossing is, in this particular place, the crossing from metaphysics, which is going to correspond to the first beginning of philosophy, crossing from metaphysics into being historical thinking, which is going to correspond, in effect, to the other beginning. And in some sense, we are in the between the first and second beginning. Although being in that between, although I don't think he uses the term exactly, I think it's clear that what's going on here is in being in the between. And as Dasein, by the way, I think one place in today's assignment at least, he identifies Dasein as the between. All right, so Dasein in one sense is in the between, and in another sense it is the between. Right? What was I going to say? But being in the between, or being the between, for Heidegger, also whether or not he uses the term, and I don't think he does, involves a certain anticipation of what he calls here as this being historical thinking. So this inceptual thinking, which is appropriate to the betweenness of Dasein, between metaphysics and being historical thinking, is in some sense the beginning of being historical thinking. I guess that's what I want to say. And now that I'm speaking this, although it hadn't occurred to me precisely this way, but I was meditating generally about the problem, it's interesting to me. You have to keep in mind that it's really interesting to me because when I wrote Novitas Mundi, which I wrote in in the 70s, 73, 74, 70, the main things, and then the things where the thinking now occurring breaks out, the appendices and the prolegomena were written really in 75, 76, maybe as late as 78, maybe the last of the appendices was written. So in the mid and latter part of the 70s, in Novitas Mundi I speak of essentially historical thinking. You see? So at least formally, obviously not meaning the same thing, as Heidegger would understand it exactly, couldn't. But nevertheless, it's interesting to me formally that there's a rather explicit analogy here between being historical thinking and what I would call and do call in Novitas Mundi years before this thing was published, right? So there's no borrowing going on here. Essentially historical thinking. And now that I'm making that analogy, and I want to just double back a little bit to what I was just talking about, the crossing as being between and being in between, right? Then in a certain sense, what I would say when people ask me this question, and I think you and somebody else has asked this question from time to time, thinking now occurring is, as it were, that's big qualification, as it were, what Heidegger would appear to be, in my language, anticipating, do you see? Except that, of course, the thinking now occurring could not be anticipated as such, okay? But if it could be, it would be something like the being historical thinking of Heidegger. Now, there are many ways in which it is not. I mean, why it can't actually be what otherwise might appear to be being what is anticipated. Hopefully we'll get into that as we go through it. The most fundamental reason being the fact that of the notion of owning, you see, the notion of owning, and then owning would be just another wrinkle that Heidegger and the translators have to play with, right? But it's the even though the question of what the self is in today's assignment, Heidegger makes radically problematic, okay? He has no notion, you see, of thinking without reference to the self, you see, as problematic as he wants to make the notion of the self, you see. So that would be the major fundamental difference, I would say. All right. But even the attempt, when successful and when made in accordance with the fundamental owning of what is to be thought, I made a note just so I get the terms right, and this goes back to the translator. Translator gives explanations of many translations, but the one that is probably most pertinent because it keeps occurring in so many different forms is their understanding of what Heidegger means by er in the German, or en, the en-owning, Ereignis, or en-owning. And what they point out on pages Roman numerals 37 and 38 is that the er, or the en in English, connotes, I would say, the way I would put it, both achieving whatever it is the prefix of, the achieving of whatever it is, owning, not only the achieving, but the enhancing, and then the doing so, the owning, achieving the owning, enhancing the owning, and owning, you see, and also doing so, in brackets, through and through, thoroughly through, or, thoroughly through, right? Okay, so I make that explicit because I think it's not easy for us to keep that in mind every time we read one of these n prefix words, but when in doubt, it might be good to resurrect those three. The point the translators are making are, in Heidegger, essentially simultaneous connotations of the prefix n in en-owning. Right?
Just add something here, because I also have the feeling that the en-owning there's a certain thrownness in that concept. It's not something you really do. It's like ennobling in the equivalent, not the equivalent, but you're just using it as an example. It's something you don't do. It's something that happens to be the result of something that you don't even necessarily intend. There's a certain, you're not the agent.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, I think that's right. That's right.
And that's quite consistent with his thinking.
Yes, right. I mean, a real simple way of putting it is that Dasein, which is what we are called to be there in this resolute and self-possessive, in the best sense of the word, self. Maybe possessive is wrong, but self-aware, self-mindful mode, to use the language he uses here. Dasein belongs to being. And Dasein is several times in today's assignment. Dasein belongs to, has the explicit meaning of being used by, right? And in that sense, it's not. That's great. That's great. So you said, I think you just said, so we are not, or whatever, we are not the agent. That's excellent, because when I was reading this this section and come across the use of the word use, right? So if you think of it, go back, for example, to Thomas Aquinas, it's very good, because this whole idea of instrumentality, which appears in spades here in Heidegger, right? But in a very rough, in a very brittle sense, a very sharp-edged sense in Sartre, right? The instrumentality, I am an instrument using an instrument, and the world is a complex of the instrumentality, which is, for Sartre, my identity, you see? Okay. If you take all that back, where does it start? It starts with Christianity, and explicitly with Thomas Aquinas, who defines in that notion of the Council of Chalcedon, that the incarnate Word is one person and two natures. Okay, that goes back to the 5th century. Okay, but Thomas, when he understands that intellectually, understands that the human nature that is unified by the person with the divine nature, the human nature, says Thomas, functions as an instrument of the divine. Right. So, in other words, God uses so humanity there in the incarnate Word is understood by Thomas as an instrument, okay, and that notion, right, and in the case of the incarnate Word, how can I put this? if Jesus is both true man and true God, as the early fathers articulated it, then what you have there is a happy coincidence, so to speak, of the humanity of this man being the divine instrument, but this man, qua person, is the principle, the agent that is using the instrument, right? You say, in other words, there you have, right? But once you get into I'm going to explode this, right? This is the big picture, right? I mean, you have to fill in all the connections, but we just make a big leap here. Once you get to the death of God, which takes a little while, it takes 400 or 500 years, but when you get to the 19th century with Nietzsche, and then we got Heidegger, and we have Sartre, and we have Waltheiser, and so forth. Once you get rid of the death of God, but you appropriate the remains, so to speak, you see, of this history, then you've got a notion of humanity, no matter how you slice it, as simply instrumental, right? And then if I'm Sartre, I got an instrumentality that, without any ultimate agency, you might say without any ultimate meaning, right? That's what Sartre would use it. Okay. Okay. I got a little off, but your statement I think is right on, and it's not as sharply stated. It's more acceptably stated, you might say, in Heidegger, for reasons that we alluded to last time, namely that even when he thinks of the what otherwise would be lack or privation in the case of Dasein and being in time, that lack or privation connotation he denies, right? And he wants to understand the openness, what otherwise would be simply an emptiness, as something positive, right? As the mode in which Dasein is free to let beings be and to be what it is potentially, right? Free in effect to realize its fate. I think might be a way of putting it. Okay. So in the next sentence, did I finish that sentence? Maybe not. I don't know. And what is to be end thought must avoid all false claims to be a work.
Did you say realize its fate?
Yes. That fate idea comes up again briefly today, but in terms of being in time, in Dasein's, I have to be very careful, insofar as, because there's no permanency here, right? But insofar as Dasein is recalled to its authentic being from its being lost in everydayness, then in that moment, all right, it is able to discard all, I forget the word he uses, but in effect all, I know what it is, all chance possibilities, do you see? And it is then in a position, as it were, to choose, you might say, the authentic possibility. However, understanding it chooses that authentic possibility in the concrete, to use the term that he uses in his critique of Hegel, in the concrete, factical, existential circumstances in which it finds itself, right? So in other words, if I'm lost in the day, then I have no way of authentically deciding what to do, practically speaking, you see? But only when I'm recalled to, only when I'm in touch with the extreme possibility of my being, death, the possibility of my impossibility, only in that context am I able to find the necessary choice that I'm to make in the factical situation. So that, in that sense, it's fate, right? But it's not. But it's a fate that I choose. You think back, the analogy here, which would be operating, I think, is if you go back to Oedipus, the Greek plays are all about fate. Oedipus is the classic fate. Now, not in a Heideggerian sense exactly, but notice what's very important in the Greek play is that, yes, Oedipus has a fate, but that fate, he realizes by making...
Avoiding it.
Well, but the point I'm going to make in terms of what I was just saying, thinking he's going to avoid it, but in other words, he makes certain choices, he makes certain decisions. You see, it's not like he's not a robot. In other words, it's not like he is, it wouldn't be interesting. In other words, he actually makes certain decisions based on, in the Greek play, his ignorance, right?
To fulfill his fate.
Yes, but his fate doesn't get fulfilled apart from his participation, right? You see, his, as it were, we would say, certainly in the modern period, we would say his free participation, and it's something like that, right? So, so fate and freedom, certainly in Heidegger, and I think in the Greek plays, analogously at least, are not, in any sense, simple alternatives to one another.
Well, there's a concept in the law of intent. So you are deemed to have intended certain things,
right?
Even
though you didn't.
Yeah, well, and even though the common person would say, "Well, I didn't intend that,"
right?
But you took certain actions that, in and of themselves, produce a result, and therefore you are deemed to have intended them.
Okay, because if you had been thinking or whatever, you would have had to have intended them, right? Yeah. Something like that. Okay. All right. So future thinking is a thinking that is underway, through which the domain of being's essential swaying, completely hidden up to now, is gone through, is thus first lit up, and is attained in its own most enoning character. All right, and again, I think another future thinking is all right because it relates to the futural notion of the ecstatic temporality and being in time. But in the German, the word also could be translated as coming. So the coming thing, it makes me think of Agamben's indebtedness to Heidegger here, right? The coming community and so forth. Maybe it's a kind of continuation in a special mode of Heideggerian thinking. It is no longer a case of talking about something and representing something objective, but rather of being owned over into an owning. And that goes to your point, right? Of being owned over, of being assigned to, conveyed to, ordained to, what dedicated to, another connotation again in the German. Owned over into an owning. This amounts to an essential transformation of the human from rational animal to Dasein. And then going down to the section 1 there, in the second paragraph from the bottom of the page, contributions to philosophy enact a questioning along a pathway which is first traced out by the crossing to the other beginning into which Western thinking is now entering. This pathway brings the crossing into the openness of history and establishes the crossing as perhaps a very long sojourn in the end. So it's not reading into Heidegger to understand that this crossing is a long sojourn. It's a long remaining, perhaps. You see, in other words, it part and parcel is that in Heidegger we have not arrived, right? We are now entering into the pathway that leads to this other beginning, and in that sense, in my language, we are somehow or other anticipating it in the form of inceptual thinking, all right? But we're not there yet, right? And we may not be there for a long time to come, so to speak, in the enactment of which the other beginning of thinking always remains only an intimation, though already decisive. All right, so we're not there, but the intimation that we have of the other beginning makes a difference. All right, it is somehow or other decisive in our being there, let me say that, in our being, or our being here, because as the translators point out, the da is T/H, right? There, here. So it's decisive in our being here because where are we now? We have moved into the crossing, right? And so the crossing cannot be separated, as it were, in its effect, as it were, from that to which it is the crossing. So that it has a kind of a backwards effect, if I can put it that way, on where we're at now. All right, so even though the contributions of philosophy always and only say being's essential sway as an owning, still they are not yet able to join the free jointure of the truth of being out of being itself. If this ever succeeds, then the enquivering of being's essential sway will determine the jointure of the work of thinking. This enquivering then grows stronger, becoming the power of a gentle release into the intimacy to the godding of the God of gods, from out of which Dasein's allotment to being comes into its own as grounding truth for being. So I pause there, again on the point that Waltraud brought up and is reinforced here, Dasein's allotment to being. Right? So another. Now again, what's interested me as I'm reading this is there are the usage of certain terms in totally different contexts that should be very familiar, especially in the morality seminar, where I speak about the distribution, the distribution of the house, so to speak, right? So you have a notion of allotment, you have a notion of distribution is what I'm trying to get at. And yet it's turned around, right? Here, Dasein is allotted to being, right? It's not that Dasein is, as it were, allotted its place, you see, without reference to any kind of belonging, right? The big picture in the morality seminar, and also anticipated, also it's already there, in a slightly different context, of course, in the ethics seminar, or the one on that comes out of a critique of Badiou, but the two things are connected. In other words, in the Badiou ethics, Badiou-related ethics seminar, what the thinking now occurring articulates in place of the notion of containment and belonging, which are the principal relationships of set theory, which is Badiou's version of ontology, right? What the thinking now occurring substitutes, as it were, for containment and belonging is the notion of embodiment. All right, and I was thinking just in everyday terms somewhere this morning, I guess it was. You should be able to see the difference between saying, let's say, John embodies, I don't know what. John embodies grace in motion, right? He embodies it. Well, it would be very different to say that John contains it, or that grace in motion belongs to John. Because, I mean, you could say those things, by the way, a little awkwardly, but you could say them. But when you say that grace in motion, John embodies it, you say, there's an identity going on there. Do you see what I'm saying? Where John is not separated from this particular thing, right? So what's missing in all of this notion of belonging, whether it's the set theory belonging of Badiou or the undermining of that belonging, which I characterized Heidegger's version of belonging to be, whether it's the undermining of a mathematical understanding or the mathematical understanding of belonging or containing, both of them, in other words, Heidegger and Badiou, on different levels of thought, at different points in the history of the development of what's left of modern thought, are very different from the notion of embodiment, where embodiment allows for the identification, the unqualified identity of the person and the quality, if you want. Yeah. Okay. Now the other thing, which I skipped over, which I don't want to skip over because it's a real challenge, is the guarding of the God of gods. All right. The general context for trying to make sense of what Heidegger is talking about is to begin with the notion that I alluded to in a different context some time back here today, and that is the death of God, right? So if the death of God begins explicitly, let's say, with somebody like Nietzsche, although Altheiser would make the case, and I think there's something to be said for this, the death of God in some sense is already there in Hegel, but not in the sense, Hegel would have been somewhat appalled by Nietzsche, I think it's fair to say. So the explicit death of God is something in the background, and Nietzsche is very much in the background of Heidegger as a subject of study. So in Heidegger there is, in effect, if not explicitly sometimes, a recognition of the death of God in the sense in which we have come to have some ordinary understanding of that. And yet he obviously does not dispense with the notion of God altogether, right? God right? However, as he says somewhere else in today's assignment, we're not talking about the God of Christianity for sure, all right? And yet, something of the divine, you see, remains in Heidegger, as, by the way, it remains in Nietzsche. For all of his fame, and I point this out, and I actually do an analysis of how it works in Nietzsche in Faith and Philosophy, but for all of his disdain for the idea of God, right, that's what dies in Nietzsche, right? But what survives, even in Nietzsche, the death of God, understand, really, it's really the idea of God that dies, and therefore it goes without saying that it's dead in Heidegger, since he's undermining the whole idealistic tradition, which he understands has its roots in Christian ontotheology, you see, and then the both of them have their roots and here's where I think he's open to some criticism, but without going too deeply into it, I think he oversimplifies it, in the idealism of Plato. I mean, in the literal sense, right, the Platonic idea. So for Heidegger, there's a continuity going on between Plato's notion of the idea and the medieval, scholastic, that's why I say it's complicated. Medieval scholastic preliminary, I think I'm putting it, to modern metaphysics, right? So so you could say that you could justify Heidegger's analysis by saying, well, yes, there is a definite effect of Neoplatonism on scholastic thinking. You see, now that's not to say that I would say it's not to say that it is at the core of it, right? In other words, I think Thomas Aquinas is neither a Neoplatonist nor an Aristotelian, for that matter. I would say, strictly speaking, he's neither, right? Although he adopts a Aristotelian formalism of thinking, but he really substantively transforms it. It essentially is something new, right? It's something that Aristotle would recognize, is what I'm trying to get at, really. And yes, probably because of his Augustinianism, he's also, through Augustine, who also was not simply a Neoplatonist, right, in his Christian thinking, in his thinking qua Christian, but nevertheless the influence of those mindsets, all right, do carry on through history, and so that gives some credibility to Heidegger's reading of the history of thought. But as I say, I think it oversimplifies. It doesn't take seriously the differences. What got me into that? So the death of God is first and foremost really to be understood as the death of the idea of God, and to the extent to which some notion or some sense of the divine can survive that. Already in Nietzsche it survives in the form of what Nietzsche calls Dionysus, the Greek god of birth and death and rebirth, the god of a kind of perpetual resurrection, death and resurrection. That's what Dionysus represents. So what does that say? That says, well, by the time you get to the 19th century, and I'm Nietzsche, what that says, well, I really don't appreciate this idea of God, but the idea of the divine is something that is a kind of perpetual striving toward unification, right? In other words, the great thing about Dionysus is, from the Nietzschean point of view, is that he doesn't succeed, right? In other words, he rises from the dead every spring, but damn it, he gets killed off again in the autumn, okay? So that might be a limitation from a Christian point of view, see? But from a Nietzschean point of view, that's great. That's okay. That's, I can deal with that, and I can interpret that as giving some credence to the notion that I can at least aspire to a kind of, I want to say, which is interesting, a kind of finite divinity, if I'm Nietzsche, right? A divinity such that I might implement within the limits of my rather particular and narrow piece of fatality, do you say? All right. So that's kind of the background to get some sense of where Heidegger is coming from here. Yes, there is a sense of the divine, but as he will say elsewhere in today's reading, the gods need Dasein. Okay. That is, there is a divinity of sorts here that is an important thought, whatever, important term, but it, in some sense, depends upon Dasein. It depends upon the being there that we are. And so, in any event, therefore, it is by no means an infinite creator, right? Which, by definition, the creator ex nihilo does not need the creation, you see. But certainly, this divinity or divinities, in some sense, does need them. And the other thing about the godding of the God of gods, I would emphasize, is also the active notion of it. In other words, that the gods themselves are not. They are not beings. They are not. They don't have an objective existence, so to speak. It reminds me a little bit. This is a little bit of a stretch, but I don't think it's a real stretch. But I mean, it's a dangerous thing to actually say it, but I'm going to say it anyway because I like danger. It reminds me of the role of the subject in Badiou. Right, the subject, the immortal, that comes into being in the consequence of an event. And is tied to that event and has no permanence. So immortality in Badiou is a kind of fleeting thing, or it's tied to an unpredictable, fundamentally unpredictable series, right? But it's not a series. It's not a series in a mathematical sense that's predictable.
Unless you're faithful.
Oh yes, if you enlist in this subjectivity. And you remain faithful to the event in the working out of the meaning of the event in the situation, right? To that extent, you support. You say it's very interesting. You support the subject in that sense needs individuals to enlist, so to speak, right? In other words, because it has no being of its own apart from that. Right? You say. On the other hand, it's a mutual belongingness, to use a Heideggerian view, because I'm really reading this Badiou back into Heidegger. It's a mutuality relationship, because while the subject is not effective without the enrollees, right? The enrollees, on the other hand, as such, are, in Badiou's terms, they're simply animals. They're simply rational animals, and Badiou's underline animals, living animals, right, of a certain nature. And insofar as they think, then they rise above their animality into this. I want to say temporary. There's another word I'm looking for. Contingent. I think that's it. I think it's a good way of putting it in Badiou's context. This contingent subjectivity. You see, this contingent immortality. Okay, so all of which is to say that it's something like that here, we're to understand that the gods need Dasein, the god or the gods or the last god becomes an important notion, is something that doesn't have any being of its own, so to speak, apart from its apart from the use, as it were, that it makes of Dasein. Okay, well, we'll come back to that. All right. Let's drop down a little bit on page 4. The bottom paragraph. The other beginning of thinking is named thus, not because it is simply shaped differently from any other arbitrarily chosen hitherto existing philosophies, but because it must be the only other beginning according to the relation to the one and only first beginning. All right. So the other beginning is not another beginning that's one among others. One among a number of other beginnings. No. It's the only other beginning. Right. So this goes to the notion of the speaking of the gods. The operative term, I think it's already alluded to in today's assignment, it becomes more important as the text goes on, is the last God. Okay? Now, the last God is associated with this other beginning. All right? And when he speaks of the last God, that brings out vividly what he's saying here in a more extended way, namely that when we talk about the other beginning, we're not talking about one among many other beginnings. We're talking about as it were, a unique other beginning. Its uniqueness is tied to the fact that the first beginning is a one and only. All right. Now, when I say that, I can't help but allude to what we've discussed in here in different contexts, and that is speaking of Peirce, who is very good at doing all this logically. So even though he does it as a pragmatist, remember in Peirce, when he speaks cosmologically, which would be at least analogous to what Heidegger is doing here, right? Cosmology would frighten Heidegger, right? But undermining the cosmological stance, the first beginning for Heidegger is analogously in Peirce, it's the absolute first, right? In other words, it's not one of a series of first, it's the absolute first, and then the analog in Peirce to the only of the beginning, right? Put in parentheses, to which we need to associate, if not identify, the last God, right? Is in Peirce precisely that. The absolute first has as its corollary what you would say in terms of Peirce's logic. You would first want to say the absolute first, and then the absolute. You could say, in terms of his logic, the absolute other. You could say the absolute second, because secondness and otherness are just that. They are the second category of Peirce's phenomenology, right? But when Peirce puts this cosmologically, the way he phrases it is we have the absolute first, and what otherwise we would expect him to say, the absolute second, the absolute other, to make it really nail it down, the absolute last. Okay, so firstness and lastness are operating in Peirce as the ideal parameters of his other self-consciousness, and the analog of that in this pre-cosmological primordial analysis of Heidegger is that there is only this is the only other beginning corresponding to the last God, is what the point I'm making to connect it with Peirce. And in turn, that's according to the relation to the one and only first beginning. The style of thoughtful mindfulness in the crossing from one beginning to the other is already determined by the allotment of the one beginning to the other beginning. So the first beginning, or the one beginning, is allotted to. I'm almost tempted to say here, I think it's correct, although he doesn't quite use the terminology. Just as Dasein at the top of that page 4 is allotted to being, and I already anticipated what I'm about to say now a little more technically. I said that in what Heidegger understands is that Dasein belongs to being. So to be allotted to, or down here at the bottom of the page, the allotment of the one beginning to the other beginning is that the first beginning, the one and only first beginning, belongs to the second beginning. All right, it's allotted to it in a way analogous to how Dasein it belongs to or is allotted to being. Thinking in the crossing accomplishes the grounding, projecting open of the truth as a being, as historical mindfulness. The top of page 5, thinking in the crossing brings into dialogue what has first been of being's truth, and that which in the truth of being is futural in the extreme. All right. So then he's kind of elaborating on what he's just said. Right. In other words, the other beginning is the only other beginning. To it is allotted the first beginning. So thinking in the crossing brings into dialogue. All right. So what is this form is? So here's where I want to say, at least explicitly. I mean, I think you could probably make a case that it's not an essential difference, but certainly in terms of Heidegger's project, it's an important difference to note. So you might say that the belonging of something of alpha to beta in set theory, that belonging need not be articulated as a dialogue, right, or as the condition of a dialogue. Right? But in Heidegger it is, right? So in other words, if the first beginning belongs to the other beginning, the only other beginning, then the relationship, that belonging relationship, is in effect the creation of a dialogue, right? And the dialogue is a dialogue or brings into dialogue what has been first been of being's truth, and that which in the truth of being is futorial in the extreme. Now that leads me to say something, and again I'm going to jump out of the text a little bit, and again I think this is a little risky, but I think this is right. And I'm anticipating a lot here, okay, but that's okay. I want to get the kind of big picture out, and then we can look at it this way. We'll see if the text bears this out. It's kind of a hypothesis. The being toward death, which is so important in being in time, is kind of pushed off here a little bit, right? Because the focus is shifted from Dasein to the being to which Dasein belongs, okay? And so in being in time, we as it were approach the question of being through Dasein's preconceptual understanding of being. Do you see? Here now we've got, it's right. I don't know whether we've backed off, which might be a Heideggerian thing to do, or we've gone back. We've backtracked into that relationship to the point where we really understand that the preliminary, the preconceptual understanding of being, of Dasein, all right, presupposes Dasein's belonging to being. I guess if I wanted to make the connection between the two texts, it's something like that. And the reason I'm tempted now to say what I'm going to say is that in this dialogue, that the belonging of the first beginning to the only other beginning is, in the dialogue that belonging sets up, or the dialogue that is the form of, I think that's probably it. The dialogue that is the form of that particular belonging, right? The form of the belonging of the first beginning to the only other beginning, the form of that belonging is the dialogue, do you see? But the two ends of that belonging, so to speak, the two participants in that dialogue, what I want to get is that the other beginning is characterized here as being that is futural in the extreme, all right? And when he uses the word extreme, one cannot help think, coming out of being in time, of the extreme possibility of Dasein, which of course is what? Death. That is, the extreme possibility of Dasein is its impossibility, right? And therefore, and this is why I say I'm going, I don't think I'm really going beyond the text, right? But I'm thinking in a way that might contextualize the text. Then that term, the last God, becomes even more significant, right? The only other beginning, right? And the only other beginning's identification and association with the last God, okay, suggests, I guess what I want to say is that I think one thing that we might keep in mind here is that the being toward death, care, anticipation as being toward death of Dasein has now been, as it were, I have to be careful now, okay, the terminology, but I think this is a loose enough term that you can use it in English without doing violence to Heidegger, that being toward death has been globalized, to say. In other words, that what we're talking about here is not simply the wholeness of Dasein, right? But now in this backtrack, what I'm calling backtracking, we're talking about the wholeness of being, all right? And remember, we said from the get-go that being in Heidegger is, awkward terminology now, to begin with, and that in what would be the first Hegelian moment, in the moment of spirit. You see, remember, he just finished saying at the end of Being in Time, spirit doesn't fall into time in Heidegger. Spirit doesn't fall into time, okay? That is, spirit falls into time in Hegel means what? Spirit becomes finite. Means, in trying to answer your question before, in effect I wound up saying, which helps here, right, that spirit implicitly, if not explicitly in Heidegger, depending on what passage you're reading, before it falls into time, is just plain old infinite. But it's as it were, Hegel would implicitly understand, it's abstractly infinite. If it's really infinite, it's got to be able to survive finitude. Okay? Well, that whole dynamic of the dialectic, Heidegger has just pulled the plug on that for openness, right? So now we start with a spirit a spirituality, the temporality of Dasein in terms of being in time, a spirit or spirituality or a temporality of Dasein that is from the get-go, without having to go through the dialectic, right? It is finite. So now when I open up and expand on that finitude of the spirituality or the temporality that is Dasein, when I expand on that, so to speak, I open that up into the notion of the being to which Dasein belongs, and therefore now I understand, as it were, how it is that Dasein has. Why is a bad question to ask in Heidegger's case? He doesn't like the word why, because it's a metaphysical question, okay? So let me switch. The how. How is it? You have to go with that one, right? Not why, but how is it that Dasein has a preconceptual understanding of being? Well, you know how it is? Because it belongs to. You see, it belongs to being. In its very being, it belongs to being, right? So of course, it has a preconceptual understanding of that to which it belongs. Right? All right. Now, what was the point I was going to make? What did I wanted to say? I want to say something more than that. Oh.
The last guy.
So on this larger stage, so to speak, we haven't gone away from Dasein exactly, you see, but now we have answered the question, how is it that Dasein, I don't know whether Heidegger realized this or not. We've answered the question, how is it that Dasein has a preconceptual understanding of being? Well, it is, the how of it is that it belongs to being, all right? But it hasn't been separated from being. So we're not dealing with two different things here, so to speak, two different entities. So now when he talks about the other beginning and the last God is associated with it later on in our text, and then later on in the text, later on in our assignment, later on in the text in general, what I want to get at is that finitude of that being, the original finitude of Heidegger's understanding of being with the hyphen here, as opposed to the metaphysical being without the hyphen. That's what the translators generally tell you to look for, although they allow for certain exceptions, that Heidegger himself is not consistent. So he doesn't always spell it S-E-Y-N, even if he means it. So often he does, most often he does, but sometimes he just goes S-E-I-N, and so you can't put the hyphen in, but it may be hyphenated in the context, okay? So it's, okay. But the point, have I said it yet? So I want to say truly, authentically finite being, all right, must have I'm not saying it's really different, okay, but just to make the point back to being in time, to the extent to which there is a different focus, right? It must have a fate or a fatality analogous to the fate or fatality of Dasein, which is very explicit in being in time. Do you see what I'm saying? So if this was a cosmology, here I'm going to put it really crudely, right? Then I'm just going to count on you to understand it better. It's as if we're talking about the end of the world. Do you see? Only now the end of the world is not a cosmological end of the world. Do you see? But a truly finite being has an extreme future, just as Dasein has an extreme possibility, which is its impossibility. So why is the other beginning the only other beginning? And why is the only other beginning associated with the last God? Do you see? A God beyond. See, I think this is deep on Heidegger's part. In other words, because he, as I said, he wants to say the not granting, the abandonment of beings by being is a gifting. It's a positive, just as what otherwise would look like a whole in Heidegger is a plus. Right? Fine. Okay. There is a kind of piety here, is what I want to say. This is what justifies my friend Altizer. But you see, Altizer confused. Altizer's first, I don't know if it was literally his first, it wasn't his first book. His first book, I think, was on Blake. But probably his first book in the 60s, when he was on the cover of, not his picture, but the substance of what he was doing was on the cover of Time magazine, The Death of God. The book he wrote was called Christian atheism, I think. There might have been another word or two in the title. Anyway, those are the key terms in the title. And at the time, I think it was Norman O'Brien or some guy out in California wrote a little blurb on the back. Now this was a positive, blurbs are supposed to get you to buy the book. But the honesty of this guy who otherwise was advocating that you read the book led him to say in his praise of the book that nevertheless you should understand that this is neither Christian nor atheism. Okay. And that's very important. So when Altizer insists, okay, that that Heidegger is theological, and Heidegger keeps denying it, by the way, a number of times. But Altizer, no, he's really theological. And there's a sense in which he is deeply theological, but it's the same sense in which you would have to say, well, if you mean by theology the theology of Dionysus, if you mean by the theology anything but, a kind of natural divinity, anything but Christian theology, okay, then Heidegger is in some sense theological, or he would abhor the term, you see, and that fits with this kind of non-existent, non-extant divinity or divinities, including the last God. But here's my real point, what I want to get to. The depth of the appreciation of this is that if I'm right, that the last God is associated with the only of the beginning, because what we have here, again, in a primordial constitutional way, not in a cosmological way, and certainly not in the way of classical apocalyptic New Testament thinking, an end of the world in that sense, right? But what Altizer, who is a great apocalyptic thinker, you see, in the modern sense of the word, right? What he appreciated about Heidegger is, in effect, if I would agree with Altizer, this is a very, and this, by the way, just for the record, Altizer says this is the really theological book, right? The contributions. What I'm getting at is that then if there is a truth to, in Altizer's sense of the word, that this is theological, where theological, despite Altizer, but in accord with Heidegger's repeated assertions, has nothing to do with Christian theology, the God of Christianity, but if it can be theological in some other sense, then in Altizer's, what Altizer's really picking up in this text is its apocalyptic nature. That's what I'm getting at, right? There's an apocalypsis here, a revelation, do you see? And when you look at it in those terms, you think back to being in time, and what is Dasein doing? It's disclosedness, it's opening up, allowing beings to be, and so forth. So all that emptiness, all that openness, all that non-being, as it were, now that nullity of the null ground of a nullity that Dasein is in being in time, all of that becomes the positive spatializing, the making room, and so forth. All that takes on a positive connotation. Well, that lighting up, that shining, that's all revelation, you see. But here, revelation not in a Christian theological context, see, but revelation in a sense of apocalypse that I would say is profoundly present in Hegel and in modern consciousness generally, you see. But Heidegger's right, is not to be confused with the Christian understanding of God or of the divine. Altizer, because he wants to run modernity and Christianity together in his atheistic Christianity, you see, probably he's not going to buy into that distinction, but nevertheless I think the distinction is there. So when I say apocalyptic, I think then that there's the finitude. What I'm trying to say is that there is a constitutional finitude to this being which comes out in the fact that it has a structure such that its other beginning is the only other beginning. You might say in Persian terms, the last beginning, the final beginning, right? The beginning beyond which there's no further beginning, and the God associated with that is the last God. That is, there's going to be. So what I'm getting at here, that's what I want to say about that. So it's not as if I think that Heidegger is not proposing here, even the way he proposes nothing very clearly and explicitly, right? But substantively, he's not proposing that if we if we were ever, after this long sojourn, to arrive at the other beginning and the coming of the last God and so forth, that would be something we would want to get beyond. We would get beyond all gods. No. See, in other words, and in that sense, it's not atheism. You see, or it's an atheism that's not atheism. In other words, the last beginning is, yes, maybe the end of the world. Right? It's in the sense of a deep apocalyptic structure to primordially finite being, the primordial finite being, which is the being of the world. Okay. But it's not as if there's an anticipation, I guess what I'm trying to say, that there's something beyond that. That somehow it would be, I have to speak pedestrian-wise, that it would like be good or it would be positive to get beyond the last beginning and the other beginning, the only other beginning and the last God and so forth, and then we'd be home free. You understand what I'm saying? No. Right? You know but it's something like that. It's a kind of cosmic, as it were, quotation marks, resoluteness that we're being called to here. Right? He transfers this in today's assignment. He speaks of the call of man, the call to man, or the call of man. I guess you could say to being historical, right? And if the being historical or historicity and being in time, as we pointed out, is a matter of fate or fatality, you see, then man is, in being called to being historical, is being called to enter into Dasein, right? To fulfill man's vocation as Dasein is to be historical. It is to participate, maybe not the best choice of language, in the fate of being. Okay? The markers of which are there, the most important marker being the extremely futural, only other beginning, which is coincident with the last God. Now that raises the question, which I hope we'll answer. I mean, I've already answered it somewhere here, but I don't know whether I can do it. We need the text. As to what then, therefore, does beginning mean in Heidegger, right? In other words, we skipped over that. We got the first beginning with the only other beginning. We got the uniqueness of the first beginning, and in effect, the uniqueness of the last beginning. And uniqueness for Heidegger is a good term. That's a good Heideggerian way of understanding things. But what can he possibly mean if we have a uniquely other, as it were, last beginning? What? And if Leahy is right, beyond which there's nothing to be anticipated. Right?
Other than ending.
Yeah, or that is the end. That is the ending. Right? Yeah. Okay. So what is
Why
beginning?
Is it called a beginning?
That's what I'm asking. You can't do that. I asked first. Okay. I want to get to that, but I want to get to the right place in the text for that. Okay. The other thing.
Oh, he does say something about the other beginning of thinking is named thus.
Where are you now?
On page 4, last paragraph.
Okay.
And if you say that Heidegger doesn't make any propositions, he certainly makes a very strong propositions about the first beginning and the other beginning.
Right. But he says he doesn't. Right? I think he would say.
Walter, I would use thus. You're focusing on the word thus?
His name
No, not necessarily. Just that he's beginning to arrive at something about why it is named the beginning.
Well, named thus, I think, would probably refer back to the previous paragraph. If in any of philosophy's hidden times it has to have decided what is its own most in the light of its knowing, then certainly in the crossing to another beginning. The other beginning of thinking is named thus. Yeah. No. Forget what I just said. I think the thus probably is what follows, which we've already been over. What he wants to say here is that it's not another among others. That's all he wants to say. It's uniquely other. Yeah. Okay. Over on starting at the bottom of page 5. And yet, whenever a being is, being must sway. But how does being sway? What is a being? From where else does thinking decide here, if not according to the truth of being? Thus, being can no longer be thought of in the perspective of beings. It must be thought from within being itself. At times, those on top 6 founders of the Abgrund must be consumed by the fire of what is deeply sheltered, so that Dasein becomes possible for humans, and thus steadfastness in the midst of beings is rescued. I would say that steadfastness here is functioning effectively as resoluteness is functioning in being and time. In the midst of beings is rescued, so that in the open of the strife between earth and world, beings themselves undergo a restoration. Now, there's a lot of stuff in there to be unpacked. One of the influences, I think, of Nietzsche on Heidegger here comes out in this notion of the founders and the few and the rare, which is one of the titles of his, right? So, or the few versus the many is what he's really talking about, right? So that there are a few human beings who are prepared to be forerunners, right, of the other beginning, right? So they're few in number. Nietzsche's version of this is what he calls the unintelligible ones, and the other. I don't know whether it's. I think it is actually is Nietzsche's image. I can't remember. It's so many years since I read the particular passage. How explicit he is in the image, but the image is pretty clearly in Nietzsche that these unintelligible ones. They would be unintelligible in the sense analogous to Heidegger, right? They would be unintelligible in terms of traditional metaphysical thinking, all right? I think in Nietzsche, and I hesitate to ascribe to him this exact analogy, but he may actually use it. But I recall it as an analogy to the Cyclopes. You remember the Cyclops in Homer, who lives in a cave on a mountain? Well, he's not the only Cyclops. What's interesting, of course, is there are lots of Cyclops, but they each live in their own cave on mountain. There's no community of the Cyclopes, right? Okay. So there's isolated, unintelligible ones is the Nietzschean thing, and something of that solitude, that solitariness, you see, of the founders and the forerunners is operative in this context. But what I wanted to just take a note of here, because it's a phraseology that comes up from time to time, and I don't know whether it's self-evidently intelligible, is that phrase in the 4th line of that top paragraph, the strife between earth and world. All right. We have some sense of world as the opening in which is that opening which in the midst of which, you might say, Dasein is from the get-go, from in being in it ahead of itself, right? In its thrownness, it finds itself in a world, all right? So worldliness accompanies, if it isn't in a certain sense, you have to be careful here in Heidegger, not in a mathematical sense, but in some substantial sense, identical with Dasein, right? To be there. And to be worldly, at least, right, are essential, and somewhat the relation. Polarity probably is not the right term, because it's more like just as being depends upon Dasein, in a certain sense, world depends upon earth, right? It goes back. It's a very ancient notion in metaphysical, the metaphysical version of which. Now, this is dangerous, but for you metaphysicians, it's a point of analogy at least. Okay, it's it's Aristotle's distinction between form and matter, right? And Aristotle, who did not believe in creation ex nihilo, understood that the world was eternal. The world, that is the world of our experience, right? And that world was a composition at various levels of form and matter. And if the world was eternal, because anything formal was actual in Aristotle, right? So the forms of the world were eternal, but those forms of the natural world, unlike the pure forms which are the divine beings that were separate from the world, right, who coexisted with it from all eternity, the natural forms, or the form of natural things, by definition in Aristotle, are the forms of one or another form of body. Right? The soul is the form of the body for Aristotle. Therefore, he's not at all sure, to put it mildly, that it survives the death of the body. Because after all, right, qua soul, it's the form of the body. If the body isn't there, how can it be there? That's Aristotle's basic attitude. Okay. That's the analogy. In other words, what I want to say is, as opposed to polarity, it's a kind of a mutual dependence, or right, of world upon earth, right, as a kind of a basis. And since we have here effectively, because we're dealing here with a kind of originary selfhood, right? I mean, this is the finite version of the absolute self-enclosedness of the Hegelian idea, right? In a pre-ideational, finite version of that selfhood, right? There's no beginning or end to it, right? And therefore there's no possible, one could not even conceive of separating world and earth, right? So their relationship is very much analogous to the eternal composition, as it were, in Aristotle, of form and matter, in Aristotle's understanding of the natural universe, right? It's something like that. Okay. And then the strife would be the Heraclitean element. It would be the dynamic interplay, which I think is a good way of putting it in the Heideggerian context, the interplay between concealedness and unconcealedness, right? So that dynamic is what he's alluding to there. All right, he says in the next paragraph, beings move into their steadfastness when the founders of the truth of being go under. Untergang, decline, ruin, failure, going under. Being itself requires this. It needs those who go under, right? So being needs Dasein, and the initiators, or you might say the forerunners, the first guys, so to speak, that are up for being there, you see, are these founders.
So when he says beings there, beings move.
Where are you now?
Just what you just read. Accordingly, beings move into their steadfastness.
Yeah.
Beings and Dasein is identical there. That was confusing.
No. That's a good point. It raises a couple of issues.
I always wanted to put
the first,
second paragraph of page 6, just in the first line there. Beings move into their steadfastness when the founders of the truth of being go under. Being itself requires this. And your question is?
When I kept seeing that throughout the text, and I kept thinking, is he... Because it seems like, from the perspective of being in time, Dasein would have been there, and now it's being. So I was just wondering why the...
Well, but the beings move into the steadfast when the founders, and I'm associating the founders of the truth, those who
are truly
authentic
Dasein, authentic Dasein, who are being there. It raises there's so many things. And again, I don't think I put my finger on it immediately, but you may have noticed, since you're sensitive to this issue, there's a place in today's reading, today's assignment, where he actually says, which in a way at least superficially, at first glance, it should remind you of Hegel. He says, actual beings are not being. Do you remember that? And we may come across, I just can't find it in my notes here.
Right. Okay.
All right. So here's what I want to say. So wait a minute. What does he mean actual beings are not being? That sounds too Hegelian to me. Right?
Because actually, it's not a word he uses.
Well, yeah, because he uses in quotes in this case that I'm referring to. he means the actual beings of metaphysics, the beings that are objectively present, are not. They are not in the context of B-ing. They're not in the context of the authentic post-metaphysical understanding of being as finite, right? Originarily finite, okay? So the actual beings of metaphysics are not vis-a-vis the finite being of this originary inceptual thinking, okay? But then I want to come to your question. I think this is connected to your question. But then beings, we might say, authentically understood, are not the actual beings of the metaphysical world of objective presence, right? Beings authentically understood are the beings toward whom Dasein is, that, right, that are in relation to which Dasein is. Those beings are not actual beings in the metaphysical sense. Okay? I almost want to say that their being, go back to the structure of his thinking and being in time, their usefulness to Dasein, their relevance to Dasein, all right, is what? It's not something fixed objectively. It is something that therefore has to do with their potentiality vis-a-vis Dasein, and Dasein's potentiality vis-a-vis them. All right? So if we get rid of the metaphysical notion of actuality, then beings in this originary sense, in this primordial sense, right? The beings in relation to which Dasein is and which are, from the get-go, always in relationship to the being in the world of Dasein, right? Those beings are affected by the founders who I'm saying, which I think is what, I don't think I'm reading into the text really, are the embodiment, if I can use one of my favorite terms, the embodiment of Dasein. So, right? Those beings are affected in that sense.
So in a certain sense, that beings could be read as other human beings who aren't these founders, and simultaneously it could be the things that one is encountering in the world, right?
All beings...
They only have their true being when
right.
these founders of truth...
Well, they only have their authentic being. They move into steadfastness
right.
when the founders of the truth go under.
Right.
So...
Okay. That makes sense.
Okay.
That makes sense.
There was something else I wanted to say there. I don't know, I lost my thought. I have lost it, so we'll have to retrieve it. Okay, so being itself in the second line there requires this. It needs those who go under. So being needs the founders. It needs those who go under, those who...
Fail?
Fail? Yeah, those who fail, who elsewhere in today's assignment he speaks of this sacrifice. Those, in effect, who sacrifice themselves, right? So in a certain sense, who go beyond themselves. And that's why I say, while the self is a problematic term, I mean, who are we, he asks somewhere in today's assignment, right? And then the answer is another question, and the answer is the question whether we are, right? Okay, so maybe another way of putting that is, in what sense are we? In what sense be we? Right? What? Be we? In what sense be we? Mm-hmm. Right? Well, authentically we be. Certainly, as he says in a number of places here and elsewhere, we authentically be we, not by being any kind of self-conscious ego. Okay? So the going under is certainly, minimally, the sacrifice of any kind of traditional self-conscious egocenteredness. Okay.
What is the German for go under?
Untergang.
Untergehen.
Untergehen. Okay.
Gain? Is that the way you say it? Okay.
Yeah, Untergang would be the noun.
Oh, well, I'm not sure.
Oh,
Yeah. Okay. Well, I wrote the noun on my margin, but he probably uses both somewhere in the text here, right? Okay, and wherever beings appear, it has already known these founders who go under and allotted them to being. That is the essential swaying of being itself. We call it ennowning. Dasein, in the next line, which is ennowned by being. Okay. And then again on this theme of the needfulness, you might almost say, of being. See, part of the that's another. Why does what does it mean that being needs Dasein or the founders or whatever or those who go under? Well, what needs anything that needs something else? You could say of it what? It's limited. Right? It is not. It ain't infinite being. You see, so beings. So again, the positive meaning of the finitude of being which, in other words, for Heidegger, no embarrassment. He's not embarrassed by the fact that being needs Dasein, because its needfulness is a function of its finitude, right? And that you could say that therefore the interplay, the notion of interplay, and when he says elsewhere, I don't know whether he alludes to it in this text, he might, the fourfold, right? The sky and earth and sky, mortals and immortals, that fourfoldedness, it's that perpetual interplay which constitutes the being of the world for Heidegger elsewhere. And there's no need, that's interesting. That's so interesting. I was going to say there's no need to go outside of that mutual needing and being at the disposal of one another. There's no need to go outside of that, right? Where
would Heidegger go?
Yeah, he would go nowhere, but it's analogous to the absolute idea of Hegel, for which there's no need to go outside of it. That's the whole point, right? So I'm almost tempted to say that Heidegger more, and I think he intends to do so, he more successfully articulates in this conceptual thinking he more successfully articulates in this conceptual thinking what Hegel calls absolute knowing, and as Heidegger points out in today's assignment, yes, but not absolute knowing, as it would be implicitly in the text in Hegel, but masterful knowing. Okay? So in other words, the finite version of absolutely being without needing anything outside of yourself, the finite version of that, right, is being reminds me of Nietzsche, being the master of your own kingdom, as small as it is. Right? Do you see what I'm saying? Okay. So this kingdom is small, not in relation to other kingdoms, because there are no other kingdoms. Right? Okay. But you understand what I'm saying. It's small in the sense that it's a finite package. It all reminds me of Einstein. Right? The finitude, the infinite finitude of the Einsteinian universe. It's a finite package, but you can't ever come to the end of it, because you're going around, by analogy, on the surface of a sphere. So it's infinite in the sense that you never come to the end, but you're bound to this limited structure, right? There's something analogously going on here, right? So what I was starting to say was, so he realizes by going down, undermining modern self-consciousness, epitomized in Hegel, he realizes more successfully something of the not needing anything else that Hegel wants to do in terms of absolute self-knowledge. Here we have masterful self-knowledge, which is the finite version of an absolute sufficiency. It's being the master, I think, in the Nietzschean sense of a limited sphere, not of an infinite sphere. Okay. And then on 6 and 7, I don't know where I don't see it there on the page offhand, but so I made a note here. And anyway, I've already said it, but I would just drive it home. Probably it's on 7, I'm guessing. He has this list from owning, echo, playing forth, leap, grounding, and so forth. The echo is the echo of being experienced as the abandonment of beings by being. All right, so that, I don't want to use the word absence because it doesn't get the full thrust of it, but the abandonment, being, leaving beings to themselves, so to speak, not as it were being there for them, right? That is all, that not granting of itself to beings, that abandonment is a gifting, right? He also refers to this as a refusal. All right, so he says, there's the not granting on page 7 below the list. The echo of being as not granting, the playing forth of the question of being, the playing forth is initially the playing forth of the first beginning, so that the first beginning brings the other beginning into play, so that according to this mutual playing forth, preparation for the leap grows. The leap into being, the leap and leaps the ground of the cleavage, and thus first the necessity of grounding Dasein, who is allotted from within being. And the grounding of truth as the truth of being is, says the translator, Dasein. All right. And then the importance of questioning at the very bottom of 7 and over on 8. You want to put it really simply, questioning is where it's at. But and he says there, I think he says in the second paragraph on page 8, questioning immediately raises the suspicion that an empty rigidity settles upon what is uncertain, undecided, undecidable. It looks as if knowing is drawn out into a stagnant reflection. It gives the appearance of being constrictive and inhibiting and even negating, right? If you got a question, your first thought is one possible first thought is, I don't have the answer. So that's a negative, right? If I have a question. But he's saying, just as the openness is a positive potentiality, you see, that the questioning is a positive condition. So in the next paragraph, there is affirmation of what is not yet accomplished in questioning. You see? And there is the widening of questioning into what is still not weighed out and needs to be considered. What reigns here is going beyond ourselves into what raises us above ourselves. Questioning is becoming free for what is compelling, though sheltered. All right. So the questioning, therefore, is the openness. Right. It's another form of the openness to being. Right. And that openness is a freedom. And what again struck me, certain analogies to the thinking now occurring, because I speak of the imperative, all right, to create the world. That the thinking now occurring is thinking for the first time the imperative to create the world. There's a certain compelling nature to being in the middle here, being in the crossing, right? Although the difference, right? In other words, as far as that goes, you could say, well, compelling and imperative, you're compelled and there's an imperative, because he makes the point, it's not a command, right? And one of the reasons I like imperative, especially in the morality seminar, is that yes, it's related historically to the notion of the commandments, right? But through the Our Father and the Sermon on the Mount, you have a historical preparation for a thinking now occurring notion of moral imperatives that need not be commands in the traditional sense, right? So there's another point of contact, as it were, with Heidegger, right? But here in this very sentence is the difference, right? So even if I were to allow, just for the sake of argument, compelling and imperative, okay, and since he's already the compulsion here, compulsion is a little different than imperative, right? Compulsion, but because it has a lot to do with this ennowment idea, I think, so it is a little different than imperative. Okay, but nevertheless, if I were to allow for a moment, if I were tempted to equate the two, that the temptation would fall through when he says, though sheltered. Okay? In other words, the hiddenness, the concealedness, you see, the irreducible strife between world and earth, that is also not there in the thinking now occurring. You see, you could say in Heideggerian terms, in thinking now occurring, the Earth is world through and through. You see, you see that the light has completely penetrated the darkness. Right? Whereas in Heidegger, for example, who's still rooted in Heidegger and in modernity, the light shines, despite appearances in Althuser, but it shines as he himself, as one would understand, he himself actually acknowledged one day in conversation, in and as the darkness in Althuser. Right? In and as the darkness. Okay? So that concealedness, that lack of any kind of absolute penetration of Earth by world is what essentially sets the thinking now occurring and this inceptual thinking apart. All right. Okay, the few and the rare, I pretty much made the point I want to make on that. The last God comes up on that page, however, page 9, where he says, a little above, just about the middle of the page, the nearness to the last God is silence. This silence must be set into work and word in the style, that is, in the manner of reservedness. All right? So these are kind of ways that are of speaking analogous to the notion of resoluteness, and anticipatory resoluteness in particular, in being in time, where anticipatory resoluteness was resoluteness, being in the moment, related to, you might say, the real necessary possibility with which Dasein was confronted, but anticipatory, adding to that notion of the moment, the being toward the extreme, its extreme possibility, I want to say in the language of this text, simultaneously. Anticipatory resoluteness is being toward the end, being toward its own impossibility. So what was, if discourse was the all-embracing, in quotes, category in the understanding, attunement, entanglement, and discourse, where discourse, in some sense, embraced the first three, what was the most authentic form of discourse in being in time? Silence. So that, analogously here, that silence now has, again, transposed itself, or been transposed under, you might say, this larger, explicitly historical destiny to which man is being called in the crossing between the first and the other beginning. That silence of anticipatorily resolute Dasein has now been enlarged in this larger picture, you see, to the silence which is the nearness to that most extreme future of being, going back a few pages, right? To the finite, if you don't want to say the death of being, which might be a little too dramatic, to the ultimate finitude of being. Right? It's ultimately not being able to be beyond itself. I like that. So now go back to Hegel. Hegel has an absolute idea which needs nothing outside of itself. In fact, that's an understatement in Hegel's case, which cannot afford to have anything outside of itself, right? Which needs to have nothing outside of itself, you see? And therefore you could say, to refine what I was saying a few moments ago, in Heidegger, he undermines that, so I now have a finite being, the internal dynamic of which is a kind of interplay of needfulness and being at the disposal of, and in that sense, it need not have anything outside of itself because it has all that it needs within itself. It as it were, it is there's a certain contentedness with its with itself on the part of the finite being. All right. The other thing I wanted to point out here, another interesting coincidence which I noticed, and again, I'm just trying to think of the timing. Well, I hadn't read this book when I wrote Foundation, and when Foundation was published, I hadn't read it. So I'm very interested to note one of the major themes that I strike in this first section of Foundation over against, I'm dealing specifically and immediately with Marx, but that's where I coined the term being commodious. And I contrast it with what in Marx and in some analogous way in American thought, in a less constricted way in American thought, is some form of being connected. Okay, so being commodious as opposed to being connected. And then that being commodious becomes a very important logical factor in the exposition in the morality seminar, because I update it, so to speak, or I bring it into the question of the real trinary logic and identify the unum as, in Kantian terms, not a question of modality, but of commodality, right? Kind of playing on the commodious idea. Now, I'm just positioning that notion of being commodious. But what I emphasize in the morality seminar explicitly, I don't know whether I say it exactly in Foundation, I may assume it, that if you go back into Latin, commodious means it's modus, it's measure, and then the com part is a measure with, right? So something is commodious if it fits with something. You see what I'm saying? So it has the notion here that it's very, at least linguistically, formally, very akin to his notion of the joining that he keeps talking about, right? But notice, to put it boldly and summarily, the difference between the function of the fitting together, Fugen, how would you say? Fugen, okay. To fit together, all right? But the fitting together that ultimately is of interest and fundamental to Heidegger, and it goes back to the fourfoldness of the interplay and so forth, it's that, if I can put it this way, I have to be careful here, what finite self-sufficiency being has or enjoys is because it is, I want to say, fit together with itself, right? So if you could speak of an ideal in Heidegger, the ideal of finite being is a self-joining, a joining together with itself, fitting together with itself, internally, so to speak, okay? Although that might be a little misleading because there is no outside, right? Whereas in the thinking now occurring, the being commodious is not self-referential, right? It's that being in its absolute differentiation is composed of beings, right, that fit with one another, all right? So in fact, an infinite plurality is maintained, but the absolute freedom, the lack of connectedness, is the perfect accommodation of each particular to every other particular, all right? Now, there is a sense in which being is commodious without reference to that plurality, conceptually, insofar as being gives, as it were, all right, this is a little tricky, as it were, gives itself to thinking completely. That's the break between omnipotence and the creature. Being gives itself to thought in the sense that what I call productive receptivity, right? In other words, thought receives being. It itself is not being. It itself does not, right? It receives being, but it receives that being productively in a sense that the two things cannot be separated from one and the other. So you could say that the mode or the way or the, maybe this is too weak, thought's receiving a being is, its receiving a being is its producing a being, right? You might say it is its creation of being. So you might say that prior to thought, there is no being prior to thought. which I think we wound up saying one day in here in response to some very interesting question that Alia asked. It's on one of these records.
What did you say? Receiving
There is no being prior to thought.
Right, and receiving.
But the receiving of being, so being receives, thought receives being, and there's no being prior to thought. But it's not just that simple, because the receiving of being by thought, which being does not pre-exist its being thought, all right, is not simply a passive reception, but it's reception which is at once the production of that being, right? And who could pull that trick off? Only omnipotence could pull off that trick, you see? And that's, if you want, the absolute immediacy, which is not captured in the nearness of silence to the last God, right? Okay.
Is a fugue, Todd?
I don't know.
Is a fugue an analogy here?
I think it actually is.
It sounds like it should be.
But I'm not exactly sure how. I know that she speaks of it in this particular book. But he brings in this word distress at the bottom, and I was wondering how that.
The distress is the distress that is experienced with the abandonment of being.
Okay. But it also, so it's related to this the interplay. When you were talking about the fourfold and this the notion that this strife is continually happening in this interplay between.
Yeah, but I don't think. I want to say no.
Okay.
I want to say. It might be. It might be somewhat related to it, but I don't think it's directly related to it. In other words, yes, there's a commonality between the notion of interplay and the notion of strife between the concealed and the unconcealed and so forth, that dynamic. But the abandonment of beings by being, I think, is something else, or it's I want to say global. It has to do with the wholeness of the situation, which is historical in Heidegger's sense of the word. In other words, this is a situation that was not before. In other words, we have it being in the crossing between the first and the second beginnings. This is, as it were. I don't think he likes the word new. He does not seem to like the word new. But this is a situation that has not previously existed, and that in that situation, the overwhelming experience of being is its abandonment. It's right of being abandoned by it. Let's put it that way.
Right.
And that is distressful. Right? And that distress is like the not granting of being, not granting itself to being or beings or even to Dasein in that sense. That's distressful, but that distress, that not granting of itself, which causes, if you want, distress, is a gift. All right, that's an opportunity. It's probably something analogous, as I'm putting it this way now, on this, what I'm calling this kind of expanded being. I'm going to play being-scape, right? We have this is the being-scape of Dasein, right? So on the being-scape here, it's the analog of the situation of angst.
Right.
Right, you see?
Okay.
I think that's what it's
like.
like.
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah, okay. Okay. Oh, and it's on page... now, so he may make a lot of propositions, which one of you or both of you have made that observation, but he tells us, nevertheless, that when we're talking about the truth, there on page 10, in the second paragraph from the bottom of the page, in the third line, what is true is not a proposition at all, and also not simply that about which a proposition makes a statement. All right. So yes, there are propositions, but the true or the truth is much more the dynamic. I almost want to say the event, or it's the disclosing of the world. It's the truing or the truth making. That's maybe not too artificial a term, but it's the disclosure that Dasein is and in its authentic mode brings about, so to speak. And therefore, and I notice here, just as I'm looking at the page, going back up a little bit below the middle of that page 10, this is something analogous to what I was saying about the thinking now occurring, that being, he says in that 3-line paragraph below the middle of the page, is not something earlier, subsisting for and in itself. Rather, enoning is the temporal spatial simultaneity for being and beings. And that's analogous, at least, to what I was saying about being not pre-existing the thought to which it is given. The primary difference at that point then being that the reception of being by thought, which being does not pre-exist, it's being received by thought, it kind of explains the distinguishing mark, namely that if the being that is received by thought does not pre-exist its being received by thought, then at least that makes intelligible that when being is received by thought, being is produced by that thought.
The creativity.
Yes, right, the creation of the world.
Yeah.
Right, that's right. And in that sense, I don't think we have anything like that here. Okay. He contrasts over on page 11, a little below the middle of the page there, always kind of outlined it above, what he calls startled dismay in italics from wonder, right? So, Aristotle says that philosophy begins with wonder. Have the basic Greek attitude. Here we have startled dismay, and that startled dismay, that dismay part of it relates to the distressful experience in the abandonment by being, and that abandonment coincides with in being in time terms of the uncanniness, the not being at home in the world, right? It's all of a sudden the familiar world is no longer familiar. It's all of a sudden it is strange, right? Alienated. Okay, all right. So this could be okay. So we contrast with one. In the next paragraph, startled dismay means returning from the ease of comportment in what is familiar to the openness of the rush of the self-sheltering. In this opening, what has been familiar for so long proves to be estranging and confining. What is most familiar and therefore the most unknown is the abandonment of being. Startled dismay lets man return to face that a being is, whereas before a being was for him just a being. Startled dismay lets man return to face that beings are, and that this being has abandoned all beings and all that appeared to be beings and has withdrawn from them. But this startled dismay is not a simple evading, nor is it a helpless surrender of the will. Rather, because it is precisely the self-sheltering of being that opens up in this startled dismay, and because beings themselves and the relation to them want to be preserved, the ownmost will of this startled dismay allies itself to startled dismay from within, and that is what we call here reservedness. All right? So that's why I say this reservedness and the steadfastness are different dimensions of the resoluteness, which the connection to the notion of will is a little more on the surface. But he's pointing to that. There is a will here. You see, it is not the will. It's not a surrender of will, but it's will in the form. Well, it's a will in the form of silence, in the form of reservedness, explicitly here, right? Restraint. I want to say, in pedestrian terms, it's in the face of the dismay and the distress, it's hanging in there. Right? You know what I'm saying? It's a kind of resolve not to panic, not to fall prey. It's of that order. Okay, so this reservedness, he says, which I've already anticipated about 14 times on page 12, reservedness is the foretuning of preparedness for refusal as gifting. Right? So being abandons beings. This is dismaying. This is distressing. The steadfastness, the reservedness in the face of this distress, of this dismay, is the preparation for the recognition, as it were, of this as a gift, of this refusal of itself by being, the self-sheltering of being, is a gift to Dasein. In reservedness, and without eliminating that return, the turn into the hesitant self-refusal reigns as the essential swaying of being. Now, again, I'm not a German speaker, but looking at the German here, I think hesitant is not a great translation. I think lingering, continuing, tarrying, I think is probably more what Heidegger has in mind. There doesn't seem to be much support for the notion of hesitation, although you can translate it that way, the German. But the German can also be translated, I think it's closer to the sense. This is a being has abandoned beings, and this abandonment, this self-refusal on the part of being, it's not that it's hesitating, right? Undecided, exactly, although there could be a kind of, I think the first connotation is it continues. It lingers in this self-refusal.
I thought the reservedness means verhalten.
Is what? I'm sorry?
Verhalten is the German word for that.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, no, but I'm not talking about the reservedness. I'm talking about the
hesitation.
The hesitation. I wrote the German down, so you might know it offhand, but I have it somewhere. He repeats the phrase. I'm just emphasizing it's the hesitant self-refusal on the part of being. I'm saying it would be better translated as the lingering self-refusal, the self-refusal that doesn't stop, right? That kind of continues on. I think that's the real thrust of it. And it reigns as the essential swaying of being. Reservedness is the midpoint for startled dismay and deep awe. These simply make more explicit what belongs originarily to reservedness. Reservedness determines the style of conceptual thinking in the other beginning. And then on the Da, dropping into the paragraph that begins just about the middle of the page, the longer paragraph in the middle of the page. Who is capable of turning into this grounding attunement of awful, startled reservedness in the essential man? And how many, all right, and they're going to be few, by the way, and how many will still assess that this attunement by being does not justify evading of beings, but the opposite, all right? And I think we can understand here in terms of what he said recently, evading of beings insofar as they are, right? Because what happens when being abandoned, then we become aware that beings are, my God, right? They're not the familiar just beings that they were, right? So one way of avoiding this reservedness or steadfastness or any of the things that it is would be evading beings, right? For it constitutes the opening of the simplicity and greatness of beings, and the originarily needed necessity of sheltering the truth of beings in being, in order then once again to give historical man a goal, right? And historical man's goal is to become the founder and preserver of the truth of being. Which, by the way, which truth of being he's just told us in the preceding clause, right, is sheltered in beings, right? So, to become the founder and preserver of the truth of being, to be the Da, as the ground that is used by being's essential sway. To be care, now he kind of expands the notion of care from being in time. Care is always, in the second line from the bottom of that paragraph, care is always a care for the sake of being. Not the being of man, but the being of beings in the whole. So how did I phrase it before when I said that the beingscape, we've gone from the Dasein, the wholeness of Dasein, and Dasein's care for beings, the beings that it encounters in the world, and its concern for other Mit-Dasein, other beings that it's with, all right? We've gone from that to care as that which is a care for the sake of being. Remember, in being in time, Dasein was defined as that for the sake of which. But now that for the sake of which here is being. Right? So this is not, again, it's not a simple alternative to Dasein, but it is Dasein's, the way I characterize it is the relationship is that we now are in a position, so to speak, to understand that Dasein's preconceptual understanding of being is a function of its being needed by being, of its belonging to being, of its being related to being from the get-go, right? So what is for the sake of Dasein is, I want to say, ultimately for the sake of being, right? The care that Dasein takes for things in the world, for beings, the care that it takes for beings, authentically understood, is a care that it takes for being. Why? Because those beings for which the Dasein of being in time takes care, okay, shelter the truth of being. Do you see? So there's no contradiction here, all right? In other words, it's a deepening if you want, right? I'm sorry Nancy isn't here, right? Because she likes the deepening. Every more Heidegger, you go deeper and deeper and deeper. Of course, there's no end to this. Although the translators say the Abgrund is not an abyss, in a sense it is an abyss, right? Right? But it's a positive abyss, so in that sense it's not an abyss, okay? But it is, in a certain sense, it's bottomless, in a certain sense. I have to be careful here, right? Because it is finite. So it's a limit. So what would be the finitude of what otherwise is an abysmal, a depth without end? What would be the end of a depth without end? It's positive thrust. You see? In other words, the limit on what otherwise would be an abyss, the limit on what otherwise would be an abyss is precisely the positive moment, in the case of Dasein, you see, or the positive historicity of being, by which it is related to its extreme future.
Now, does that ever eventually pan out or play out to be something other than distress for Dasein? In the sense that he probably never gets to joy in this book or something like that. But
yeah, right. I think
is there something in the direction of that would be like a positive limit? Yeah. Well, I know it's not joy, but
no. I think it's already there for Dasein in notions of resoluteness.
Yeah.
Here
right.
in the context of steadfastness and reservedness and the going under, the self-sacrifice. Mm-hmm. I mean, you can imagine it's at least a kind of Nietzschean joy in that.
Right, yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
right. A surrender of any kind of narrow, egoistic sense of being, a kind of going... I was thinking of the... you're the opera guy, and you're the German guy, so between the two of you, Götterdämmerung is Wagner, right?
Right.
And literally would mean what? The...
Twilight of the Gods.
Is it the Twilight?
The Twilight, is that a good one?
Okay. But I was reminded of that. There's a certain I don't know whether this is Twilight or not, right? But there's a certain kind of...
Well, there's a pretty
in
violent
between.
Twilight.
Yeah.
Twilight of the
But the
Gods.
in-between has a little bit of a sense of a demo.
It's reminding me of the dawn in Purse a little bit, the in-between also. I mean,
Okay.
just in that
Yeah. That would be the dawn would be the positive version
right.
of nightfall.
Right.
All right, and then so again on the and then very importantly on page 13, and this gets repeated a number of places, in just about the middle of the page, the longer middle paragraph there. In this way, the inceptual mindfulness of thinking becomes necessarily genuine thinking, i.e. a thinking that sets goals. What gets set is not just any goal, and not the goal in general, but the one and only. All right. Again, one thing I like about Heidegger is he's into uniqueness. Right. So as far as that goes, that's good. Except that later on in today's assignment, after pushing this uniqueness, he equates it with the same. So it's a little troubling. It's not an unalloyed uniqueness. But anyway, he's got this thrust. The one and only, but it has to do with the uniqueness of the first beginning and the uniqueness of the other beginning. So here he's saying it's not just the goal in general, but you could say, if he were a metaphysician, he would have to say here a very specific goal, but he doesn't want to say that. Okay, but the one and only and thus singular goal of our history, this goal is the seeking itself, the seeking of being. All right. So your complaint a couple of periods back was that, there's a I don't know what the complaint is the right term. A nostalgia for some kind of outcome, right? So, but the seeking is where it's at. The seeking itself. The seeking is the goal. And that is very, again, analogous, not substantively, but formally analogous to something I find myself saying, especially most recently in informal and maybe somewhere in the seminars or somewhere on one of these records, that in the thinking now occurring, the end, read here, the goal, is absolutely the means. Or you could reverse it then. The means are absolutely the goal, right? And so this is analogous to that, except that in the thinking now occurring, when you're dealing with an existence which is the absolute now, for the first time, there's no time for seeking. There's no temporality. There's no distant. Did you make the analogy between Heidegger and Augustine's notion of time? I thought you did. And I don't know that we said it explicitly in that class. I mean, you no doubt, I assume, had it in mind that Augustine defines time as a distension of the soul.
Right,
That's what you probably had in mind, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. And so the ecstatic nature of Heideggerian temporality is a kind of formal throwback to Augustine's understanding of time as a distension of the soul. Of course, soul is problematic in Heidegger, right? But formally, it's analogous, right? But in the thinking now occurring, there is no distension, there is no distancing, there is no expansion in that sense. And while I'm on the absolute now, I don't know what this has to do with anything, but it occurred to me that the one other way, which I don't think I've ever put down on paper anywhere, so I'll put it on the recording, is that if you want to get to the I was thinking about the not yet and the not still. I still haven't gotten today, and I don't know, maybe we will in the next 5 minutes, hopefully. But if we don't, we'll get to it next time. What exactly is beginning in Heidegger? What does beginning mean? But when I was thinking about that, I had to think, well, what is it in the thinking now occurring? And I think I came up with a very succinct definition of it by accident, really, in the morality seminar, which Chuck noticed, and he took a time, and we took about 30 seconds while he meditated on the phrase, but somewhere in the morality seminar, probably in the third seminar, as I say, by accident, because I was doing something else. I wasn't looking for a definition of beginning. But in the context of what I was doing, it turned out that a good, succinct definition of beginning is the not yet, not still, or the not still, not yet. That's the beginning, right? And there's no room to maneuver there, right? There's no spatiality about that definition. Okay, and I was thinking, but the not yet, we know, famously or infamously, is the absolute now in the thinking now occurring. So what is not yet is absolutely now. And there's a logic to that which is on the website. So then I was thinking, another way of putting all of this, which I like, is that this is the mathematical conceptualization, if you square the absolute now squared, is the beginning of existence, right? You might almost say absolute now qua actual is the beginning, right? So I just put that. I just want to get that somewhere on the record. Now,
is this seeking itself? I've been in and out of these things. But is this the existential or?
No, I don't think so. No, this would be the existential with the A, I would say. In other words, this is the genuine. See, remember, a genuine thinking, a thinking that sets goals.
Yeah.
So I would say this goal is the seeking itself.
For Heidegger, though, this is existential. This is the existential goal.
Right? Yeah. Except I don't know whether he's still holding as rigorously as he holds to that distinction in being in time.
Yeah.
But if I understand the thrust of your question, no. This is in the sense of being in time. This is existential, AL.
Right.
This is of the structure of the situation, if I can put it that way.
Yeah.
And so what we're dealing with here, all right, so the goal is the seeking of being, and analogous to this, or part and parcel of this, is the other notion that speaking of creation, right, when he uses the word creation, it's very clear here and elsewhere in the text, on this same page in the third paragraph, the fourth paragraph beginning from the bottom, where he has the seeker, preserver, guardian, and caretaker. This is what care means as the basic trait of Dasein. Man's determination is gathered in these names. All right? So you could understand here, in terms of your question, care, understood authentically, care when it is not lost in everydayness, is authentically seeking, right? And qua authentic, it's the seeking of being, it's the preserving of being. I don't want to do this for him. He may do it himself, but let me try and do it for him. It's preserving what? It's preserving being, because it's preserving being the truth of being that is sheltered in beings. You see, it's preserving guardian, right? And the caretaker. And this is interesting, because I don't know whether you remember, I know you were flat on your back in the morality seminar.
Thank you.
But it was very interesting. Something like this must have come up in the morality seminar. And Steve Hoth, the biologist who attended the seminar, Steve says he was trying to help out. We were searching for a word to describe probably the relationship between the person and the world. And he put on the table steward, which is very biblical, very religious notion and so forth. And I couldn't quite embrace it, right? I couldn't, right? Caretaker, right? But caretaker presumes what? That there's something there to be taken care of. But if you're creating the world, there's nothing there to be taken care of, right? And by the way, there's nothing to care for. There's something to do, okay? And there's nothing to be anxious about. Okay. All right. So despite the use of the word creation here, it's very clear that we're not talking about anything like, and Heidegger would not be embarrassed to say so, anything like creation ex nihilo. And to the extent to which he has to the extent to which he does appropriate the notion of creation from the tradition of creation ex nihilo, as I point out in Novitas Mundi, he does so by taking nihilo in that sense that's prohibited by Aquinas as a material cause. So, and that does translate into Heidegger's primordial or conceptual thinking as the nullity, the nothingness, which now has a positive spin on it, of course, but nevertheless, as the nothingness, the openness, the potentiality, which is the arena or the framework, if there is such a thing as a framework here, within which Dasein realizes its fate, or being has its historical fate, in which a la Badiou, or Badiou a la Heidegger, in which man is enlisted, right? To which man is called to be a participant, I want to say an enabler, which I think is interesting. It's a very interesting.
It also has the en.
Yeah. Okay. So, and again, the same, right below that, necessity of creating. So let me finish on this, at least for today. So, okay, so man is the seeker, preserver, guardian, and caretaker. That's what care means. All right. And then in the bottom half of that same paragraph, and it is only on the strength of this origin as the grounding of time-space that Dasein can become an abiding for transforming the distress of the abandonment of being into the necessity of creating as the restoring of beings. Right? So to go back to your earlier question, I want to qualify it. To the extent, right, insofar as Dasein becomes an inabiding for transforming. In other words, Dasein. If Dasein answers the call, what that answering is in effect is a transforming of the distress of the abandonment of being into the necessity of creating as the restoration of beings. Right. So the response to the distress, in that sense, it's a transform. I don't know if that's joy. I don't know whether that's any kind of final, in the sense which I thought your question was pointing at. Final resolution, Do you see what I'm saying? Or if it is a final resolution, it is in a Heideggerian sense a final resolution. That's a resolution with an eye to the extreme future.
Right.
Right. So it's a resolution with an eye to, in this context, I would say, to the finitude of being. So with an eye, or in the context of a steadfastness and a reservedness that is functioning in terms of the extreme future of being, then the authentic role for man in answering the call to the history of being, or to participate in the history of being, the authentic response is to care for beings, that is to create them in the sense of restoring them. Now, as soon as you say restoring, we're talking restoring them to some original...
To something that they have lost.
Yeah, but now it gets tricky because he makes this point... Pardon me, is that you? He makes this point in Being in Time, that for Heidegger, the going back, remember, the past and the future and the present, they're inextricably bound up to with one another as inseparable, I would say, dimensions or ecstasy, ecstatic forms of temporality, right? So he makes this point. So what is the beginning? I'm going to answer my own question real quick, and then we'll look at the text next time. The beginning in Heidegger is origin, and origin. The beginning, he says in today's assignment, you may recall, it grounds itself as it reaches forward. All right. So in other words, the going to the. So if I extrapolate, the going to the extreme future, which is analogously what is happening in the context of the being-scape of the Beiträge, analogous to the anticipatory resolution of Dasein, it's being in the moment and being toward the possibility of its own impossibility, right? So beginning, as a general proposition in Heidegger, is the self-grounding that reaches forward, and what I want to say is the further it reaches forward, you would be not be surprised to find out in Heidegger, the further back it goes. The origin withdraws. You almost could say, if you had any tolerance for mathematics, the origin withdraws, as it were. Now I say as it were in deference to Heidegger. It withdraws in proportion to the forward grasping and the forward reaching of the beginning, to say, that is, I want to say, anticipated in this conceptual thinking. So,
you never get there?
Well, I think you don't get there in the sense in which I understood Todd's original question about joy. I don't think you get there. But see, for Heidegger, that
you get the repetition, though.
Well, you
right?
get no, but you don't get there. You don't get there in an ontic, everyday sense of the word. You don't get there. Right. But that's the whole point. You do get there by understanding in certain way that for you to be there or here authentically, you must, in some primordial sense, be there. I mean, be there to be here. You have to be at the. You have to be here in the mode of being at the end. And then if you are here in the mode of being at the end, then you have the real possibility of authentically choosing that possibility in the factical situation, which is necessary and not a chance possibility. That you don't get distracted and lost into the busyness of our everyday existence.
And that's beginning.
But what I want to say, it's a beginning.
Right.
The other side of that futural. So remember, he said very early on in this book that Dasein is its past, and its present comes to it out of the future. So Dasein now is its past, but its being now, or in the present, its past, is something that comes to it out of the future. You can't separate the two. So the more future it is, the more it is in the moment, the more authentically it is present to itself in the non-objective sense, but then the more it is in a mode of retrieving the past, not in any kind of everyday sense, trying to repeat what happened. Let's all wear three-pointed hats again. Get back to the good old days, that kind of thing. No. But retrieving the past in the sense of what was possible, right? Retrieving the past qua possibilities, qua potentiality, if you want. So when going authentically into the future by being authentically in the moment, I now go back further. The more I do that, the more authentic that is, the further back I go to the origin, and the further back to the origin, the more in contact, the more rooted I am. I think this is a Heidegger way of understanding it. The more in contact, the more in touch, the more authentically I am attached to, in some sense, the origin, which I am in this kind of finite explosion, extreme future, authentic moment, present, and deep withdrawing of the origin, which I never lose touch with. I'm going back to my authentic possibilities, and all of that comes into play. Right? You see, I can't make the right decision here if I'm not in touch with the most originary possibilities of my being.
Can I add to that? Because in one of the readings that I have done, there's a combining of what you're just talking about.
Okay.
Because the seeker, preserver, guardian is seen as the past, present, and future. The seeker is the future, the preserver is the past, and the guardian is the present.
Okay.
Which I thought was just because that's.
But what was the other one? The caretaker.
Well, the caretaker, that's what care is about. I mean, that's in a sense a way of doing, saying the same thing that's being said about what Dasein is. So the caretaker doesn't.
Well, I'm thinking it might relate to that notion of discourse and silence. True discourse is silence, and the true taking care. Right? In other words, it would be the comprehensive thing that if you're seeking, preserving, and guarding, then you're taking care of being.
It becomes a totality of caretaking. Correct.
What was that the point? I didn't want to cut you off your thought.
No, that was the point I was trying to make, because it related to what you were saying.
Okay.
In terms of intertwining.
Yes.
The future, past, and present, and here it is intertwined in these.
Yeah, I like that. That's helpful. Thank you. Okay. So.